The spotlight was on Marvin Gaye, but his eyes were fixed on something else. In the front row sat a man in tattered military fatigues, tears streaming down his weathered face. Without warning, Marvin set down his microphone and did something that shocked 18,000 people into complete silence. What this homeless Vietnam veteran had written on a piece of cardboard would move the Prince of Soul to act. If stories like this move you as much as they move us, please subscribe to our channel for more untold tales of music legends who changed lives beyond the stage. The air inside Chicago Stadium was electric that October night in 1974. Marvin Gaye was at the peak of his powers, his voice soaring through What's Going On, as 18,000 fans swayed to every note. The song had become an anthem, a cry for understanding in a world torn apart by war and social upheaval. But as Marvin reached the chorus, something in the front row caught his attention and made him do the unthinkable. He stopped singing. The band continued for a few bars before they too realized something was wrong. The bass line faded, the drums went silent, and 18,000 people held their breath. Marvin's eyes were locked on a figure in the front row, a man whose weathered face told a story of pain that words could never capture. The man held a piece of cardboard in his trembling hands, and what was written on it would change everything about that night. What did that cardboard sign say that could make the Prince of Soul abandon his performance mid-song? The answer would reveal the true character of a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful performance happens when the music stops completely. As Marvin set his microphone on its stand and walked toward the edge of the stage, security guards moved to intercept him, but he held up his hand. This was his show, his moment, and no one was going to stop what was about to happen. The homeless veteran in the front row was named James Robert Thompson, though the world wouldn't learn his name until much later. He was 43 years old, the same age as Marvin, and he had served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to a country that seemed to have forgotten him. The cardboard sign he held contained just 4 words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 broken promises and shattered dreams. I fought for this. As Marvin Gaye stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward James Thompson, something extraordinary happened in Chicago Stadium. 18,000 people, who had come to hear music, were about to witness something far more powerful than any song. The silence was so complete you could hear the veteran's labored breathing, the rustle of his torn fatigues, and the soft thud of Marvin's footsteps on the concrete floor. But what happened next would become the stuff of legend, a moment that would be talked about for decades to come. Marvin didn't just approach the veteran, he did something that no one in that stadium expected, something that would forever change how people saw the relationship between performer and audience, between celebrity and humanity. Berry Gordy, who was watching from the wings, later said he knew in that instant that he wasn't just watching a concert anymore. He was witnessing history being made, one human connection at a time. But even Berry, who had discovered Marvin and guided his career, couldn't have predicted what his star would do in front of 18,000 witnesses. James Thompson had arrived at the concert with nothing but the clothes on his back and a story that would break your heart. He had been living on the streets of Chicago for 3 years, ever since his discharge from the Army Medical Corps, where he had served as a medic in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The trauma he had witnessed, the lives he couldn't save, and the friends he had lost haunted him every single day. But it wasn't just the war that had broken him, it was what he found when he came home. The cardboard sign told only part of his story. James had fought in Vietnam believing he was protecting the American dream. But when he returned, that dream seemed to exist only for others. He couldn't find work, couldn't get the medical help he needed for his service-related injuries, and couldn't escape the nightmares that visited him every night. The government that had sent him to war had seemingly forgotten he existed. But on this particular night, something had drawn him to Chicago Stadium. Maybe it was the power of Marvin Gaye's music, or maybe it was the message of What's Going On, a song that spoke directly to the pain and confusion he felt about the world around him. Whatever it was, James had scraped together enough money for a ticket and found himself in the front row, holding a sign that represented everything he had lost and everything he still hoped for. What Marvin Gaye did next would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in entertainment history. Instead of calling security or returning to his performance, Marvin knelt down beside James Thompson's seat and looked directly into the veteran's eyes. The 2 men, both children of the same turbulent decade, both shaped by the same cultural forces, stared at each other in a moment of perfect understanding. And then Marvin did something that no one saw coming. He took off his own jacket, a beautiful sequined blazer that caught the stage lights like diamonds, and wrapped it around the veteran's shoulders. But that wasn't the end of it. As 18,000 people watched in stunned silence, Marvin helped James to his feet and began walking him toward the stage. The veteran, weak from malnutrition and years of living rough, leaned heavily on the soul legend as they made their way through the crowd. The audience didn't know whether to cheer or cry. Many did both. This wasn't part of the show. This was real life unfolding in front of them, raw and unscripted, and more moving than any performance they had ever witnessed. But Marvin wasn't done yet. What he was about to do would create a moment that would be talked about for generations. As Marvin helped James Thompson onto the stage, the veteran's legs almost gave out beneath him. The bright lights, the sea of faces, the overwhelming emotion of the moment threatened to overwhelm him completely. But Marvin's strong arm kept him steady, and his gentle voice whispered words of encouragement that only James could hear. What happened next was pure magic. Marvin guided James to the microphone and gestured for him to speak. The veteran, his voice shaking with emotion, managed to say just 3 words, "Thank you, brother." But those 3 words, amplified through the stadium's sound system, hit the audience like a thunderbolt. 18,000 people erupted in the longest, loudest ovation Chicago Stadium had ever heard. But Marvin wasn't finished with his act of kindness. As the applause continued to roll through the stadium like thunder, he turned to James and made an offer that would change the veteran's life forever. He invited him to stay for the rest of the show, not as an audience member, but as his guest on stage. For the next hour, James Thompson sat on a chair beside Marvin's piano, watching as the Prince of Soul delivered one of the greatest performances of his career. What happened that night in Chicago Stadium didn't end when the final note was played. The image of Marvin Gaye helping a homeless veteran, of a superstar using his platform to shine a light on America's forgotten warriors, spread through the music world like wildfire. But more importantly, it sparked something in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Before the week was over, James Thompson had received job offers from 17 different companies in the Chicago area. A local veterans organization reached out to provide him with housing and medical care. Most surprisingly of all, other Vietnam veterans began coming forward, sharing their own stories and finding the help they desperately needed. Marvin had done more than stop his concert to help one man. He had started a movement that would grow far beyond anything he could have imagined. But the story doesn't end there, because what James Thompson did with his second chance would prove even more remarkable than the moment that gave it to him. James Thompson took the job offer from Mercy Hospital, where he became a counselor for other Vietnam veterans struggling with what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Within 2 years, he had helped over 200 veterans find housing, employment, and medical care. He became a living testament to the power of one moment of human kindness to change everything. But James never forgot the night that changed his life. Every year on October 15th, he would return to the spot where Chicago Stadium once stood and leave a single white rose. He would stand there for exactly 1 hour, the same amount of time he had spent on stage with Marvin Gaye, and remember the moment when a stranger became a brother. The connection between Marvin and James didn't end that night either. For the remaining 10 years of Marvin's life, the 2 men stayed in touch. James would later reveal that some of Marvin's most powerful songs, including portions of Sexual Healing, were inspired by their conversations about trauma, recovery, and the healing power of human connection. Here's something most people don't know about that legendary night in Chicago. Marvin Gaye almost didn't perform What's Going On. His manager had advised him to focus on his more commercial hits, worried that the song's political message might alienate some fans. But Marvin insisted, and it was during that very song that he spotted James Thompson in the crowd. The backstory behind this decision reveals even more about Marvin's character. Earlier that day, he had received a phone call from his brother Frankie, who had just returned from his own tour in Vietnam. Frankie had shared stories about the homeless veterans he was seeing on the streets of Detroit, men who had served their country with honor only to return to a society that seemed indifferent to their struggles. That conversation had been weighing heavily on Marvin's mind as he prepared for the Chicago show. When his manager suggested dropping What's Going On from the set list, Marvin became unusually adamant about keeping it. He told his band that night, "Some songs are just entertainment, but some songs are prayers. Tonight we're going to pray." None of them understood what he meant, until they saw him walking toward James Thompson in the front row. The irony wasn't lost on either man. What's Going On was a song about understanding, about reaching across the divides that separate us and finding our common humanity. In stopping his performance of that song to help a stranger, Marvin had lived out its message in the most powerful way possible. But there was something else happening that night, something that spoke to the deeper spiritual connection Marvin felt between his music and his purpose. As James would later reveal in interviews, He had been carrying that cardboard sign for 3 days, hoping to find the courage to make his story known. He had tried to approach other public figures, had stood outside government buildings and veteran affairs offices, but no one had stopped to read his simple plea. The words "I fought for this" represented not just his service in Vietnam, but his ongoing battle for recognition, for dignity, for the basic human acknowledgement that his sacrifice had mattered. The morning of the concert, James had made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He had written a letter to his sister in Milwaukee, the only family member who still spoke to him, telling her goodbye. He planned to attend the Marvin Gaye concert as his final act, one last moment of beauty before ending his pain permanently. The ticket had cost him his last $18, money he had saved from collecting bottles and doing odd jobs around the city. But something changed when Marvin's eyes met his across that crowded stadium. James later described it as feeling seen for the first time in years, truly seen by another human being who understood that behind the tattered clothes and weathered face was a person worthy of respect and compassion. In that moment, his despair began to transform into something else entirely. Years later, James would tell reporters that he believed fate had brought him to that concert. He had been at his lowest point, contemplating ending his own life, when something compelled him to spend his last few dollars on a ticket to see Marvin Gaye. That decision, and the cardboard sign he made from a discarded box he found outside the stadium, changed not just his life but the lives of countless others. The James Thompson Veterans Center in Chicago, which opened in 1988, stands as a permanent reminder of what can happen when one person chooses compassion over indifference. The center has helped thousands of veterans over the years, providing everything from job training to mental health services to simple human dignity for those who served their country and found themselves forgotten. But the story of how that center came to be reveals another layer of the extraordinary chain of events that began that night in Chicago Stadium. 3 years after the concert, a wealthy businessman named Robert Martinez was driving through the same neighborhood where James had once lived on the streets. Martinez stopped at a red light and noticed a man in his rearview mirror helping another homeless veteran find shelter for the night. When the light turned green, Martinez pulled over and approached the Good Samaritan. It was James Thompson. Martinez, who had made his fortune in construction, was so moved by James's dedication to helping other veterans that he offered to fund a permanent facility where this work could continue. But James had a condition. The center would be built on the exact spot where he had once slept rough, and it would be open to any veteran, regardless of their circumstances or the nature of their discharge from service. The groundbreaking ceremony for the James Thompson Veterans Center took place on October 15, 1985, exactly 11 years after the Chicago Stadium concert. Marvin Gaye was supposed to be the keynote speaker, but his declining health prevented him from attending. Instead, he sent a video message that was played for the assembled crowd of veterans, city officials, and community members. In that message, Marvin spoke about the night he met James, but he also revealed something that few people knew. The encounter had inspired him to establish a private fund that quietly paid for housing and medical care for homeless veterans across the country. By the time of his death in 1984, Marvin had personally helped over 300 veterans get back on their feet, never seeking publicity or recognition for his efforts. The center's most remarkable feature is its wall of stories, where veterans can share their experiences through written testimonials, photographs, or audio recordings. The very first entry on that wall is James Thompson's original cardboard sign, now preserved behind glass with a simple plaque that reads, "It started with 4 words and changed thousands of lives." Marvin Gaye never lived to see the center named in James's honor, but his influence was felt in every brick of its foundation. The two men had remained close friends until Marvin's tragic death in 1984, and James spoke at his funeral, telling the assembled mourners about the night a stranger saved his life with nothing more than kindness and recognition of shared humanity. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of that night in Chicago Stadium is something that can't be measured or quantified. It's the reminder that no matter how high we rise, no matter how bright the spotlight shines on us, we are all connected by our common humanity. Marvin Gaye understood that truth in his bones, and on one unforgettable night in 1974, he showed 18,000 people what it looks like when we choose to see the person behind the pain. What makes this story even more remarkable is a connection that wouldn't be discovered until 20 years after that night in Chicago Stadium. In 2006, while researching the Gaye family history for a documentary, a filmmaker uncovered military records that revealed an extraordinary coincidence. James Thompson had served in the same medical unit in Vietnam as Marvin's cousin, Robert Gaye, who had been killed in action in 1968. When this information was shared with James, now 65 years old and still working at the Veterans Center, he broke down in tears. He remembered Robert Gaye clearly, a young medic who had saved countless lives before losing his own to a mortar attack during the Tet Offensive. Robert had often spoken about his cousin back home, who was making it big in the music business, though James had never made the connection to Marvin Gaye until that moment. This revelation added a spiritual dimension to the story that neither man had been aware of during their friendship. James began to believe that Robert's spirit had somehow guided him to that concert, had somehow ensured that his path would cross with Marvin's when he needed it most. Whether you believe in such things or not, the cosmic nature of this connection cannot be denied. In the end, the story of Marvin Gaye and James Thompson isn't really about a famous musician helping a homeless veteran. It's about what happens when we stop, really stop, and see each other as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. It's about the power of one moment of genuine compassion to ripple out and change the world in ways we never could have imagined. But perhaps most importantly, it's about the reminder that we all carry our own cardboard signs, our own silent pleas for recognition and understanding. Sometimes we hold them up for the world to see, and sometimes we keep them hidden in our hearts. The difference between despair and hope often comes down to whether someone stops long enough to read what we've written and responds with compassion rather than indifference. James Thompson lived until 2013, working with veterans until the very end of his life. He never again needed to hold a cardboard sign asking for recognition or help. Instead, he spent his final decades holding up others who found themselves in the same desperate place he had once been. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, the James Thompson Veterans Center was filled with hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. At his funeral, they played What's Going On. And in that moment, everyone present understood that the song's message of love, understanding, and human connection had found its perfect expression in the friendship between a soul legend and a forgotten warrior who became brothers on a stage in Chicago. The service concluded with a reading of the letter James had written but never sent to his sister, the goodbye letter he had planned to mail after the concert. Instead of ending his story, that night had given him 39 more years to write new chapters filled with purpose, love, and service to others. That night in 1974, Marvin Gaye stopped his concert to help a homeless veteran. But what really happened was that 18,000 people learned what it means to truly care for one another. And that lesson, more than any song he ever recorded, may be Marvin Gaye's greatest gift to the world,